Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little velvety around the edges. Soft lighting, a mug of whatever feels warm and forgiving, maybe a blanket that pretends to be a small private kingdom. If you're ready, we're drifting into Georgian England, the kind with powdered wigs, powdered faces, and morals that were also powdered, lightly dusted, then blown away. If you're listening in a quiet room, welcome. If you're on a bus pretending you don't see anyone, also welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tell me where you are and what the sky looks like. Dawn, night, something in between. Wherever you are, we're going to move slowly. We're going to glide past the grand front doors and peek politely at the mess that lived behind them. Because tonight is about the Libertines, the people who believed pleasure was a philosophy, a method, and, when convenient, a very good excuse. So, let's float to London around 1714. Hanover on the throne, money starting to pour through the city like hot chocolate at White's. London was expanding, shining, and consistently covered in soot. The middle classes were discovering virtue. The aristocracy, bored and immunized against consequences, was discovering options. And beneath the very respectable chatter about commerce and improvement, people were inventing new ways to be naughty without looking messy, or at least pretending they weren't messy. This is Georgian elegance, which is to say, velvet wallpaper over a very noisy plumbing system. The world of the Libertines didn't appear fully formed. It seeped out of places that were, at least on paper, respectable. Coffee houses, gentlemen's clubs, the theater, all those venues built for conversation and improvement, then improved further by wine, wagers, and finally, a lot of what if we just didn't. Londoners loved a room with rules. They loved breaking them even more. Take White's, for example. Founded in 1693, it was supposed to be about chocolate and company. It evolved into an upscale chaos laboratory. In the famous betting book, men laid down money on basically anything, from whether it would rain, to whether a man in the corner would survive the night, to whether someone would run off with someone else's wife before Lent. High taste. Higher stakes. If you're wondering whether they sometimes bet on human misery like it was a horse race, of course they did. White's cultivated a delicate skill set, wearing a fine coat, losing a fortune, and then sighing as if it were theater. Next, drift to the Kit Kat Club. Founded around 1696, it's remembered for its portrait series, its toasts to beauties, and its cheerful Whig partisanship. Not exactly a den of scandal, but a useful training ground in elite sociability. Mutton pies gave the club its name. Naturally, those pies became more symbolic than culinary. Men learned the art of witty praise, polished flirtation, and the gentle alchemy of pretending that appetite was taste. The Kit Kats looked like respectable patriots, and many of them were, but they also normalized an atmosphere where private amusements were protected by public seriousness, a helpful skill for what came next. The Dilettanti Society, founded in the early 30s with Grand Tour veterans with wine on their breath and grease in their eyes, pushed things a little further. They adored Ruins and Bacchus with a kind of classical sincerity only possible after a very late night. They funded archaeology. They also funded hangovers. Portraits from the society show members draped in togas and embroidered self-confidence. Their joke was simple and effective. If we drape it in Latin, it's culture. If we add a laurel wreath, it's fine. And honestly, it often was. Many of them genuinely loved art. They were also very good at disguising indulgence as aesthetics. This too will be a theme.
Where was the oxygen feeding all of this? The stage. London's theatre world exploding with new venues and, crucially, actresses. Women on stage were something new in England after the Restoration, and by the Georgian period, they had become a magnetic field for aristocratic attention. Actresses occupied that socio-cultural no-man's land, too visible to be respectable, too witty and skilled to be dismissed. They were perfect partners for men who wanted conversation with their transgression. You could attend a performance, applaud the craft, then applaud again in private. If the applause came with a lease on a small apartment, that was considered efficient. Let's drift to the masquerades. If you'd like a single image that defined libertine London, it's a mask tied gently at the back of the head, a costume that lets you pretend you're not yourself, and a room full of people pretending they don't recognize one another. The impresario John James Heidegger made these events sparkle at the King's Theatre in the Haymarket from the 1710s on. Tickets were expensive, the crowd was brave, the music was very obliging. People could attend for the dancing while quietly negotiating adventures in alcoves and stairwells. It was all delightfully plausible until someone's cousin recognized someone's other cousin, because yes, even the anonymous version of London was still London. Masquerades were genius because they outsourced guilt to fabric. A domino cloak, a Venetian mask, a sly misidentification. People could claim it was all a game of misrule imported from Venice, and sometimes it was. But those late hours in a building that could switch from opera to carnival weren't just disappearances. They were rehearsals. Elite culture learned how to run two scripts at once: respectable program in the front, improvisation backstage. Meanwhile, the pleasure gardens, Vauxhall and Ranelagh, perfected the art of mixed company under the stars. At Vauxhall, the dark walks earned their nickname the honest way. The architecture was an accomplice. Lanterns, supper boxes, concealed turns. You could stroll with everyone and be very polite. You could also vanish for a bit. Handel might be playing, fireworks might be promising the heavens. Down on the gravel, ankles were having more sincere conversations than faces. We should pause and meet some of the women who became icons of this world. Kitty Fisher, one of the best-known courtesans of mid-century London, made a career out of being almost mythic. Painted by Reynolds, celebrated in verse, she understood publicity before publicity understood itself. Her style was crisp, her influence obvious. She died young, smallpox 1767, which gave her legend an uncomfortable gloss. Fanny Murray, another celebrated figure, rose from poverty to fashionable triumph and then to a careful, respectable retirement, which annoyed moralists who preferred their fallen women to stay, well, fallen. Grace Dalrympe Elliott, tall and unapologetic, moved between London and Paris, the mistress and memoir cycle working exactly as advertised. They were clever and sometimes ruthless. They needed to be. The men playing this game did not carry all the risk. That brings us to the clubs that went beyond masks and mutton pies. Let's float downriver to Medmenham Abbey on the Thames near Marlow, where Francis Dashwood turned a medieval ruin into a plush stage set for a group that later generations would call the Hellfire Club. Yes, there were earlier Hellfire clubs, including the short-lived anti-clerical fun of the young Duke of Wharton around 1719. But when people imagine candles, classical statues, and do what thou wilt in Latin, they're usually thinking of Dashwood's circle in the 1740s-60s. Dashwood, later Lord Le Despencer, was the kind of man who collected classical motifs like a magpie collects shiny metal, then arranged them in suggestive order. He renovated Medmenham Abbey into a kind of fake monastery. The members styled themselves Monks of St. Francis. Subtle. The motto, Fais ce que tu voudras, comes from Rabelais by way of Renaissance carnival. Do what thou wilt. Simple, effective, extremely convenient. The idea wasn't satanic gloom. It was parody and parody's best friend, license. You dress it as a joke so you can test the rule. And if anyone objects, you call them humorless.
Membership lists are notoriously fuzzy because secrecy ages better than paperwork. Names that float through the haze include Dashwood, of course, the poet Stuart Paul Whitehead, the politician Thomas Potter, and the perpetually combustible John Wilkes. The Earl of Sandwich, John Montague, yes, the sandwich guy, lurks around the edges, equal parts pious, scolding in public, and lively in private. Benjamin Franklin visited Dashwood's West Wycombe estate while in England. Did he attend a ceremony? No solid evidence. Did he appreciate a good wine cellar and a wittily bad Latin motto? Strong odds. The Hellfire Caves at West Wycombe, artificial grottos cut as a public works project in the 1740s, added the theatrical subterranean touch. You enter the dark, you emerge into light. Very classical, very tidy. The caves also solved a practical problem: privacy. It's not easy to be transgressive in a Georgian drawing room with 10 servants and a neighbor who collects gossip like seashells. Underground spaces, by contrast, don't talk. Well, except to the newspapers later. What actually happened at Medmenham? The safe version? Masquerade carried into private ritual, parodies of monastic ceremonies, classical themes, Venus and Bacchus getting more than polite nods. Women were present, sometimes called nuns in the club's jesting language. Many were actresses, singers, or high-end sex workers. Some may have been willing co-conspirators in the stagecraft. Others had fewer choices than their male companions and more to lose if things went wrong. The surviving evidence suggests a spectrum, from consensual play to situations where consent gets complicated. It's the uncomfortable truth that clings to most elite pleasure systems. The philosophy said freedom, the economics said otherwise. Let's drift for a moment with John Wilkes, whose life reads like a list of ways to set yourself on fire while pretending you meant to. Sharp wit, physically plain in a way he turned into a weapon. A friend to Dashwood at one moment, a bitter rival of Sandwich at another. In the early 1760s, Wilkes co-produced with Thomas Potter a pornographic spoof called An Essay on Woman, a parody of Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, with notes pretending to be by the Bishop Warburton. Subtle like a brick. Unauthorized copies were used against him in a grotesque, clumsy prosecution. The state overreached with general warrants. Wilkes fled, came back, got expelled from Parliament, got re-elected by voters who loved a scrapper, and became a walking advertisement for civil liberties and the power of a good grievance. Was the Hellfire Club directly responsible for constitutional reform? Not exactly. But the social world that nurtured libertine play also generated confrontations that put liberty in very practical conversation with vice. Wilkes's battles forced Parliament to clarify how far it could reach into private life. Irony doing its usual job. The libertine culture that mocked piety helped strengthen protections that everyone used later. Not the plan, still the outcome. We can stroll back to London now and step into Carlisle House in Soho Square, where the celebrated Teresa Cornelius hosted a run of legendary masquerades in the 1760s. Cornelius was a singer turned entrepreneur with a flair for logistics in silk. Her events attracted nobility, merchants, diplomats, and the sort of people who like to say, "I really shouldn't," while doing exactly that. Giacomo Casanova drifted through her orbit, because of course he did. Cornelius' events were polished, theatrical, and expensive. They also blurred the lines between performance and participation. You came to see, you ended up being seen. You might have preferred the first part. Around the corner in Covent Garden, Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, an annual directory of prostitutes published from 1757 to the 1990s, made sexual commerce look like consumer choice, with names, descriptions, and little reviews. It's a bleak document wrapped in gossip. The libertine elite pretended they were philosopher aesthetes. The list reminds us the city was also a market, and markets don't flatter anyone for long. Many women used that system strategically. Many were used by it. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other. Let's float to a printed image. William Hogarth's engravings,
A Harlot's Progress and A Rake's Progress in the 1730s offered moral panoramas of vice turning into ruin. Hogarth was not subtle. He served his satire warm, but his pictures saw something accurate, the way public amusements, private indulgence, and economic desperation braided together. His rake passes through a masquerade, a brothel, a prison. He isn't a libertine hero, he's a warning with nice shoes. Back to the clubs. The Sublime Society of Beefsteaks, founded in 1735, deserves a quick wave. It wasn't libertine in the sexual sense, but it perfected the art of aristocratic male conviviality. Meat, song, ritual, and a sense that being together behind a door created a tiny state. These kinds of clubs taught organization. The Libertines borrowed that, then traded the roast for Roman statues. We should talk about religion because parody only works if there's something to parody. The 18th century saw revivals that were profoundly sincere. Methodists filled fields with prayer. Evangelicals started societies for charity and reform. The Society for the Reformation of Manners had been around since the late 17th century and kept reforming. In other words, libertines had opponents who weren't only hypocrites. Many were earnest, energetic, and quite skilled at making trouble for people who thought they were above trouble. This tension, piety against play, kept Georgian London alert, and sometimes, accidentally, balanced. If we lean in on the Hellfire Circle again, a small detail stands still and waves for attention. Paul Whitehead, Dashwood's poet steward, had his heart, just the heart, placed in an urn at West Wickham after his death as a club token. It became a macabre tourist attraction until it was stolen in 1829. Yes, that happened. Even the relics of parody became relics themselves. People are nothing if not consistent in their need for souvenirs. Membership rumors in the Hellfire orbit are best handled with tongs. Lord Bute, the king's favorite, frequently whispered, never proven. Franklin, as noted, visited West Wickham, admired the landscaping, and kept his diary discreet. John Montague, Earl of Sandwich, was definitely an enemy of Wilkes and a public moralist. He also seemed to enjoy some of the private uproar, as many public moralists did. The safe sentence here is, London gossip believed many things. The safer sentence is, gossip sold papers. By the 1760s, the Medmenham set was thinning. Scandal, age, and the exhausting logistics of never-ending chic impropriety took their toll. Dashwood moved on to government posts and respectable pursuits, as men did when they got older and needed to reassure the bank. The caves at West Wickham remained. The abbey sat in its pretty setting. The myth filled in the silence. Was all this just wealthy men behaving badly? Some of it, yes. But the libertine habit also changed how elite society thought about privacy, about the idea that there is a self behind the mask and behind the public performance. It shaped the architecture of houses, hidden staircases, retiring rooms, flexible spaces that could be sober at noon and whispered about at midnight. It influenced publishing, private print runs, circulating manuscripts, and the idea of limited audiences. It taught Britain how to manage two faces at once, the public face and the private face, which would come in very handy when the Victorians turned respectability into a national sport.
We can glide back to the masquerade rooms for a moment. Picture an evening at the King's Theatre. Early in the night, everything is powdered and architectural. Later, the candles burn lower. The music reaches for your shoulders and suggests gently that they relax. The floor is a sweep of satin and possibility. Someone leans in and says a clever thing that could also be an invitation. By dawn, everyone will act surprised and say it was all a misunderstanding. In a sense, it was. The Libertines taught people to misunderstand each other strategically. Out in the gardens at Vauxhall, Jonathan Tyers curated morality and mischief with equal zeal. He commissioned art that instructed. He installed lighting that seduced. He hired musicians who drew tears. And he kept the paths dark enough for choices. The city circulated through these spaces like blood. Merchants imitated aristocrats. Aristocrats imitated actors. Actors outdid everyone. And somewhere in a quiet corner, a couple decided that tomorrow they would pretend they had never met. It was a culture of fluid identities, which sounds modern because it is. Georgian London was modern in ways it tried not to admit. We should also speak softly about the cost. Gambling ruined families. It was almost a genre. Debts turned to duels. The press pretended shock while counting sales. Women who moved in these circles learned to read faces like novels, because faces told on you before you could afford to be told on. Some women retired with money and a garden. Some ended in debtors' cells. The city was generous with thrills and stingy with safety nets. This is not new. It just wore better fabrics. What did the Libertines read? Everything classical they could quote, plus French novels they pretended were research. They borrowed from Montaigne, from Rabelais, from Roman poets whose Bacchus poems never went out of style. They drank philosophy like claret, often with similar results. The conversation mattered, and sometimes it really did lead to something more than amusement. They talked about tolerance, about how much the state should care who met whom in the dark, about satire's right to be impolite, and occasionally, while defending their own freedoms, they defended yours too. That's the awkward symmetry. Bad motives can produce useful precedents. The law doesn't ask why you needed privacy, it only decides if privacy exists. If you're still awake, and I hope the softness of this has helped, you might be wondering where the boundary sits. When does parody become harm? When does license become pressure? The historical record is clear enough to be honest and vague enough to be safe. There were parties that were play. There were parties that used people. There were lines that men like to call blurry because blurring lines is convenient. The libertine world depended on the idea that everyone at the party wanted to be there, and sometimes that was true. Other times, rent was due, reputations were fragile, and saying no had a cost. Let's drift gently out of London again to West Wickham's Hill with its curious church and its gilded ball. Dashwood had a sense of scenery. He planted views with the calm certainty of a man who assumed people would always be looking up at his house. He created a landscape that pretended to be ancient while being aggressively new. That is very Georgian. The period loved a fake antique. It also loved a ritual that told you the rules were pretend, so you could pretend to break them.
Before we close part 1, we can wave to a few figures at the edge of the frame. The future George IV as Prince of Wales, who would later make Regency excess fashionable by calling it taste. Mary Perdita Robinson, actress turned royal mistress turned poet, who understood that literature could be a lifeboat when court favor ran out. Dorothy Jordan, long-term partner of the future William IV, a woman who did domestic stability and stage work simultaneously, and was punished by both worlds for it. They belong slightly later, but they are the inheritance. The Libertine script didn't vanish. It just hired a better tailor and moved to Carlton House. Tonight, we've walked softly through the front rooms, the public spaces where libertinism taught London to turn privacy into an art. We met the clubs that blurred ideals and appetites. We visited theaters and gardens that choreographed consent and curiosity. We glanced into caves that turned parody into ceremony. We watched a few men gamble their reputations, and a few women gamble their futures. It was polished. It was clever. It was sometimes kind. It was also frequently selfish. Human, in other words, just wearing a wig. The story continues, of course, slowly, without urgency. We'll keep following the drift next time into the mechanics of secrecy and the aftertaste of scandals. how the Hellfire legend grew larger than the gatherings that fed it, how reformers answered sin with committees, and how committees invented an entire century of respectable performances. But for now, the candles are low. The orchestra has packed up. A coach door closes, softly. And somewhere, a mask is untying itself, ready to be folded and placed in a drawer that everyone swears doesn't exist. If your eyes are heavy, that's fine. If not, I'm still here. The city is still out there, powdered and problematic, waiting for us to wander again. Let's leave it under the lamps for tonight.
Hey again. If you've refilled your cup, perfect. If your room is a little dimmer than before, even better. Tonight, we're staying in Georgian England, but we're moving more quietly. We're slipping past the masquerade staircase and into the machinery behind it, the part where pleasure needed paperwork, where secrecy needed a floor plan, where the law learned, somewhat reluctantly, that privacy wasn't just a fashion, it was about to be a principle. Let's glide back to the clubs and their private rooms where laughter carries poorly through thick drapes. Libertinism wasn't just the chaos of parties, it had logistics. Those cozy gentlemen's clubs didn't advertise this, obviously. They didn't need to. The rules were unwritten, mostly because writing things down is an invitation to trouble. Membership wasn't just about wealth, it was about discretion. The well-dressed man who didn't talk in the street, the clever hostess who knew which guest would enjoy a book of questionable poetry and which guest required one about gardening. To get inside any real circle, you started at the edges, a supper where the conversation waded into double meanings, a small theatrical after-party with a music choice that drifted some polite to teasing, a card table, naturally, because nothing exposes the soul like the willingness to lose. If you didn't flinch at the right moments, if you laughed at the right line from Horace about wine and wisdom, you went on the quiet list. Congratulations, you'd been noticed by people who didn't like admitting they noticed anyone. There were little tests. Someone might slide you a private print, a verse, a pamphlet, a mild indecency dressed as wit. Did you keep it to yourself, or did you bring it back tomorrow pretending you found it in a gutter? The safest answer was to say nothing, store it in a drawer, and learn from it without quoting it at dinner. The libertine world liked appetite. It worshipped self-control. Ironically, yes. The stage again offered the best introductions. Actresses sat in the front row of this social experiment, and not always by choice. You could be talented, admired, invited, and broke by Thursday. Patronage was a ladder with odd spacing between the rungs. Some women climbed, some were pulled. Some found that ladders can also tip. The more expensive the venue, the more elaborate the choreographies of transaction. And in that choreography, the libertines refined one of their core beliefs, that consent could be curated by setting. Invite the right people, pick the right theme, provide the right wine, frame it with learning. That was the trick. Call your party a Homeric symposium. Almost everyone relaxes. We can drift downriver to Medmenham again, to the faux abbey and its witty Latin motto. The monks of St. Francis were not monks, obviously. They weren't even very consistent with fasting, but they were extremely consistent with allegory. Rabelais' "Do what thou wilt" hung like incense over everything they did. They loved the classics, loved the idea of parody, loved the feeling that breaking a rule was elegant if you broke it in Latin. They wore the ancient world like a cloak, classy, plausible, and very good at hiding stains. What happened there, as we said, was theater. You performed transgression as ritual, so you could pretend it was art. The records are so thin you can see daylight through them. That wasn't an accident. Clubs like this didn't keep minutes. They kept moods. And moods don't get subpoenaed. The surviving scraps, poems, letters that don't quite confess, hint at wine-fueled ceremonies that inverted piety for fun, for desire,
and for that delicious feeling of doing something you're not supposed to while claiming it's an intellectual exercise. Again, convenient.
Meanwhile, back in London, a different crowd was learning to raid the pleasure economy for profit. Publishers, printers, the man who looked at a manuscript and thought, if I get arrested for this, it will at least sell out first. Edmund Curll was the early champion of that sport. He published smut disguised as conversation, and conversation disguised as scholarship. In 1727, Curll was prosecuted for obscene libel, one of the first English cases to chase obscenity in print. He kept publishing anyway, because of course he did. Half of Georgian London pretended to be offended and bought his books. The other half pretended not to buy them and read them by candlelight. A couple of decades later came the most famous text of them all, John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, better known as Fanny Hill, 1748–49. Written in prison, prosecuted out of print, and yet somehow always available, it presented a universe made of satin and performance. The Libertines approved the aesthetic, if not the sincerity. Officially, they disapproved. Unofficially, they had opinions about the prose. The authorities, unamused, convinced themselves that if they could stop one book, desire would pack up and leave the city. It didn't. Print culture wasn't just naughtiness. It was also the seedbed of privacy law, because the same state that wanted to ban erotic novels also wanted to chase satirists. Enter John Wilkes, riding in like a spark with a grudge. When Wilkes attacked the ministry in the North Britain, No. 45, 1763, the government responded with general warrants, arrest orders without names, sweeping up printers, booksellers, and anyone who looked like a pamphlet in human form. Wilkes sued. Others did too. Out of that mess came crucial rulings. Wilkes v. Wood, 1763. Entick v. Carrington, 1765. Judges concluded somewhat grumpily that the state couldn't knock down your door on a hunch and take your papers just because it felt untidy being criticized. Privacy, your space, your desk, your letters, became a zone with actual rights. You can thank libertine-adjacent chaos for that. Not exactly the intention of the wine parties, but very much the consequence. While the courts stitched boundaries around doors, Henry Fielding, the novelist-turned-magistrate, and his half-brother John Fielding, blind and extremely effective, were professionalizing policing from Bow Street. The Bow Street runners started to put shape to the city's nighttime. They targeted thieves, brothels, and anything too loud to ignore. Did they bust the powerful? Occasionally. Mostly they enforced quiet, which was the government's favorite virtue. Quiet kept everyone's masks from slipping in public. The libertine circles learned to schedule better and to avoid leaving paper lying around. Discretion became less a virtue and more a countermeasure. We should talk about the pleasure gardens again because they were laboratories where public and private were taught to dance together without stepping on toes. Vauxhall Gardens, under Jonathan Tyers, had an official morality baked into its design. Allegorical paintings, patriotic music, the whole Enlightenment picnic. Meanwhile, the Dark Walks offered unsupervised electives. Ranelagh, with its enormous rotunda in Chelsea, provided indoor elegance that looked like a planetary model where the stars had dress codes. If the gardens felt refined, so did the social arrangements that happened at the edges. The trick was always the same – make the respectable middle so charming that no one looks too closely at the margins. And then there were the lists. Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies, published annually from 1757 to the 1790s, is a relic both infamous and revealing. A directory of London sex workers, written with the voice of a strolling connoisseur, it pretended to be a civic service for man who just wanted to spend wisely. The entries are sometimes witty, often cruel, occasionally horrified. It reads like a ledger of human choices in a city that mistrusted honesty unless it could be monetized. For the libertine elite, the list was both resource and alibi. If everything is a market, then nothing is a sin. Handy. Also untrue. Let's float toward a handful of personal stories, because the libertine universe was tested most painfully on individuals who tried to live inside it for real. Elizabeth Chudley made herself a small kingdom out of charm and costume. She rose at court as a maid of honor, famously wore almost nothing at the 1749 Venetian masquerade at Ranelagh, scandalously dressed as Iphigenia, because subtlety was for people with fewer friends. She secretly married Augustus Hervey in 1744, separated, and then married the Duke of Kingston in 1769, pleading that the first marriage didn't count. It did. A bigamy trial in 1776 made her the season's entertainment. Found guilty, she fled abroad in diamonds. She lived the rest of her life in style, which annoyed moralists, but the law had made its point. Libertine marriage math, just call it complicated and drink wine, collided with statutes that did not find that cute. Seymour Dorothy Fleming, Lady Worsley, is another quiet thunderclap. Married to Sir Richard Worsley, she had lovers. He knew. The couple played games that were not purely theoretical. In 1782, he sued her lover George Bissett for criminal conversation, adultery damages, expecting to cash in on the insult. Lady Worsley's defense detonated his case. The jury heard that Sir Richard had essentially condoned, even facilitated her affairs. There was a famous print by Rowlandson, Lady Worsley's Bath, showing Sir Richard hoisting Bissett to spy on his wife bathing. Not discreet. The damages were set at 1 shilling, a legal version of a shrug. The case turned a very private game into a public humiliation and taught the country a memorable lesson. If you treat marriage like a stage prop, don't be surprised when the audience laughs at you. Mary Robinson, Perdita, stepped through this world with both grace and the unfortunate legs of a mortal. An actress who caught the eye of the Prince of Wales in 1779 became famous, briefly royal adjacent, and then quickly discarded. A carriage accident in 1783 left her partially disabled. She reinvented herself as a writer, poet, novelist, essayist, turning scandal into craft with more intelligence than her critics deserved. She died in 1800, not old, having learned that the Libertine stage gives standing ovations and then charges rent on the exit. Sophia Baddeley, Nancy Parsons, and the many other famous and half-famous women of the circuit carry similar footnotes. Beauty was currency, wit was an investment, age was the tax. The best escaped with a cottage and a garden. Many didn't. The libertine philosophy claimed to be devoted to pleasure. The economy that underwrote it was very interested in leverage. The men paid too, sometimes. Gambling was the acceptable way to go bankrupt in public. Faro tables in fashionable drawing rooms, including those of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, turned fortunes into anecdotes with alarming efficiency. Georgiana herself, political hostess, fashion leader, emotionally complicated, ran up debts that chased her through decades. Her marriage managed the odd feat of being chilly and crowded at once. The Duke installed their friend, Lady Elizabeth Foster, as a permanent third. It was not subtle. But then subtlety had been out of fashion since the masquerade invitations went out. We should look more closely at the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, because his early life is essentially libertinism with a furniture budget. Carlton House became the stage where excess dressed as taste, and taste occasionally turned into a wall bracket. The prince's debts were legendary because nothing says freedom like mortgaging next year for more champagne tonight. Maria Fitzherbert, whom he married secretly in 1785, was Catholic, which made the marriage invalid under the Royal Marriages Act and inconvenient under pretty much everything. She was a center of gravity in his life and a reminder that private vows and public law rarely hugged in that era. Around them spun a circle of friends whose primary loyalty was to the party and to the mirror. It set the tone for the Regency, where libertine habits learned to fold napkins correctly and call themselves civilized.
Let's drift back to the masquerades for a moment, to the practical side of their magic. Teresa Cornelius, the impresaria of Carlisle House, built an empire on tickets intact. Her balls were not just parties, they were social markets where you could audition for a better life. She sold spectacle with an accountant's accuracy. And then the money ran out. Bankruptcy, arrests for unlicensed concerts, one reinvention after another, coffee house, milk business, a waxwork show, before death in 1797 in poor circumstances. It's the short version of a common story. The people who curated pleasure for the rich often ended poorer than the guests who leaned against the gilded banisters. Parliament and the pulpit, meanwhile, developed a shared hobby, improving the nation. The Magdalen Hospital for Penitent Prostitutes opened in 1758 as a philanthropic project offering shelter and reform to fallen women. The quotes around fallen are doing a lot of work. Some were helped, some were scolded. The idea that women needed moral rescue and men needed new cards remained popular. In 1787, George III issued the Proclamation for the Encouragement of Piety and Virtue and for the Preventing and Punishing of Vice, Profaneness, and Immorality. That is not a short title, which tells you the mood. A proclamation society formed to prosecute vice, illegal gaming, obscene prints, Sunday trading. Moral reform had discovered committees. The Libertines discovered they preferred diaries to letters. Architecture kept up with everyone's needs. Townhouses grew quiet annexes. Country houses acquired rooms that could shift purpose with a hinged wall. Hidden doors were not simply romantic, they were effective. West Wycombe's Hill displayed a church with a golden ball on top, part observatory, part wink. Dashwood loved a joke built out of stone. The caves below offered processional spaces that turned the movement from bright to dark into a narrative you could walk through. Modern tourists go for the curiosity. The 18th century went for the permission. On paper, it looked like two cultures, the reformers with their hospital committees and the libertines with their winking Latin. In reality, it was one culture, constantly negotiating. Elite men might support the Magdalen Hospital and still attend a very elegant supper the same week. Respectability worked like a cloak you could wear over anything as long as you didn't get caught in the rain. The prosecution of obscene libel trimmed the edges. The courts drew lines around searches. The city learned a new rhythm: transgress, retreat, reform, repeat. Let's float through a few more rooms and watch the press at work, because caricature artists were the documentary filmmakers of their day. William Hogarth, earlier in the century, drew moral panoramas with the confidence of a man who had seen too many hard mornings. Later, Thomas Rowlandson and James Gilray specialized in knives disguised as jokes. Gilray in particular set the standard for political cruelty. He loved the Prince of Wales the way a hawk loves a rabbit. In Gilray's prints, gluttony and lust wore familiar faces. Satire achieved two things at once. It thrilled the audience and vaccinated the system. A little outrage prevents bigger fevers. Also, it sold well. The law developed a parallel economy of humiliation. Crim con trials, criminal conversation, where husbands sued their wives' lovers for damages. The public ate it up. Transcripts sold like hotcakes. The gallery was full. It was respectable voyeurism with an invoice attached. Sometimes the husband won big. Sometimes, like Worsley, he was reduced to a 1-shilling warning not to be ridiculous. The trials served the same function as satire. They vented pressure, reminded elites that they were technically mortal, and gave the middle classes a reason to feel superior without spending too much money. We should step aside and ask a sleepy question. Did libertinism actually change anything besides furniture bills? Yes, it did. It changed how elite society understood boundaries. Before this era, privacy was habit. By the end, it was a principle with case law attached. The state learned that general warrants were not a toy. The press learned it could push back. Theaters learned new ways to imply. Architecture learned to lie politely. Women in the system learned to be writers, negotiators, and escape artists, sometimes all in one year. It wasn't liberation, don't give it that much credit, but it widened a corridor.
where later people would walk a little more freely. Of course there was a cost ledger, and it didn't balance neatly. Women's reputations were fragile glass. A single crack, and the market acted like it was their fault for being glass in the first place. The actresses who escaped with comfort did so with skill plus luck. Many more left only a whisper in a ledger or a line in a pamphlet. The men who burned themselves on the gaming tables discovered that Parliament was more forgiving than creditors. The system had cushions where it mattered. One more figure waves from the wings: Sir Francis Dashwood's poet and clubman, Paul Whitehead. After his death in 1774, his heart was placed in an urn at West Wycomb's mausoleum as a club relic. Decades later, a tourist stole it. An almost comically Gothic footnote. But it tells you something real. The genteel parody had created its own relic culture. Symbols had become important. Even the joke turned serious if you held it long enough. By the late 1760s and into the 1770s, the Medmenham Circle had dissolved into memory, and the masquerade craze was fading under debt and fatigue. But the style had migrated to drawing rooms in country houses, where the ceremonies were less formal and just as effective. Small, curated groups, themes with plausible deniability, classical references ready to be dropped into conversation in case anyone uninvited wandered in. Meanwhile, the war in America and tense European politics made blatant excess feel impolitic. Not that anyone stopped, they just drew the curtains thicker. It's worth noticing the paradox at the core. Libertines insisted they were universalists: pleasure, wit, wisdom for all who could appreciate it. In practice, the door policy remained what it always had been: money first, connection second, silence always. The Enlightenment spirit was there, so was the ledger. Both fit neatly into a city that loved ideals as long as they came on time. You can almost hear the gears shift as the century turns toward the Regency. The Prince's set will make transgression look like interior design. The moral reformers will build bigger committees with longer names. The courts will continue to defend desks from general rummaging. And the artists will keep drawing the world as a dinner party where the soup is excellent and all the in-jokes involve debt. Before we close tonight, we should speak softly about the ways women bent the script. Not just the famous few, but the hundreds who refused to be only decoration. Mary Robinson wrote. Hester Thrale Piozzi hosted, then scandalized, then wrote again. Frances Burney documented the inside of polite rooms with an almost surgical calm. None of them were libertines in the Hellfire sense, but all of them navigated a culture that pretended women's voices were optional. They made themselves not optional. If libertinism widened the corridor of privacy, these women furnished it and set out the lamps. The city's habit of secrecy learned a final refinement in these years: the art of being seen to be hidden. Private dinners advertised as select. Clubs founded with the innocence of business discussion that somehow had back staircases. Publishers pretending that controversial texts migrated to the press by accident. Everyone got remarkably good at staging discretion, which is not the same as having it. But it worked often enough to count.
Shall we leave a few threads waiting for next time? We haven't yet opened the door at Brooks's, where aristocratic Whigs turned gambling into a sacrament and found that politics sounds more persuasive when accompanied by dice. We haven't lingered with Georgiana at her faro bank, where kindness and compulsion braided themselves into a lifetime of IOUs. We haven't walked through Carlton House when the candles were low and the prince was deciding whether to fall in love or redecorate. We haven't watched the committees grow into societies and the societies develop a taste for prosecutions that would define the early 19th century. We'll get there, slowly, without hurrying the night. For now, the streets are damp, the lamps are reflecting softly, and the city looks almost innocent. It isn't, but it is tired, and that helps. The masquerades are over for the season,
The caves are quiet. A book with an unwise title is being slipped into a desk drawer. A woman who carried the evening on her back is taking off her shoes and thinking about breakfast. The law, which has been sour all day, is asleep. When you're ready to drift, let the buildings dim around the edges. There's a carriage somewhere, late, the wheels soft on the stones. Tomorrow, there will be more gossip than tea and more bills than anyone remembers incurring. But tonight, there's just the gentle hush of a city that tried very hard to be clever about desire and discovered that cleverness is its own kind of mask. Fold it up, put it away. We'll pick it up again, carefully, in the next part.
Hey again! If the room's a little cooler tonight, that's good. History behaves best at a low simmer. Top up your drink, find the comfortable spot, and let the city shuffle its cards a little closer. We're staying with Georgian England. Same velvet, slightly different mess. Now we drift from candles in caves to candles guttering over green bays. We're going to the clubs, the tables, the rooms where losing your fortune was a hobby and calling it taste made everyone feel better. Let's float down St. James's Street. On one side, White's, which you know, old, expensive, cheerful about betting on anything that moved and quite a few things that didn't. On the other, Brooks's, the Whigs' preferred lair, born from William Almack's coffee house and reinvented into a sanctuary for hazard, faro, politics, and long sighs over empty pockets. These weren't just rooms with chairs. They were weather systems. If you were powerful, you came here to be seen losing with style. If you were almost powerful, you came to learn how to. Charles James Fox sits at the center like a hearth. A genius in debate, catastrophic with money. He wore ruin like a comfortable coat. Fox would rise in the House of Commons with sentences that bent and then landed like feathers, and then rise at Brooks's with a handful of dice and the optimism of a man who believed fortune owed him a favor. He was adored by the Devonshire house set, the Duchess and her glittering circle of political hostesses, actors, ambassadors, and people who could drink until 3 and still be witty. Fox and Georgiana were a pair of magnets for public delight and private anxiety. He lost fortunes, she helped raise ballots. He gambled nights, she gambled reputations. Brooks's itself learned to manage chaos with polished manners. The whole thing was very calm unless you counted the part where people kept selling their futures to pay for last night. IOUs drifted like snow. The waiters kept the book, the gambling book, where debts and bets lived together as if they were reasonable neighbors. People signed with a flourish. A gentleman's promise was supposed to hold. Sometimes it did. More often, the club became a bank without interest, patience, or mercy. White's had its own ledger of risk, a famous betting book where men recorded predictions and odds, a catalog of idle prophecy and very real outcomes. It wasn't rational. It was ritual disguised as arithmetic. Now Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. The era's favorite face, the century's favorite cautionary tale. Married young to a duke who treated tenderness like a rumor, she built her kingdom out of conversation and kindness. Her salon at Devonshire House set the tone for Whig society, lighter, cleverer, looser at the edges. She adored Fox and campaigned for him in 1784, walking the streets of Westminster and doing what duchesses weren't supposed to do, which is speak to strangers before supper. One story said she kissed voters. It made for good prints and worse sermons. Whether she did or didn't, the idea stuck because it sounded like something Georgiana might dare if the cause asked nicely. Back at home, the faro bank grew into a problem that smiled and kept smiling. Faro, a card game with odds that seemed friendly until they weren't, became the late-night glue of fashionable houses. You could run a bank,
host the game, and make a little percentage from the play. Or you could sit, lose softly, and promise to pay later. Georgiana did both. Her circle's gaming tables swallowed more promises than any court could enforce. Debts multiplied. The Duke, calm, chilly, paid a portion because the family name liked quiet. He also installed Lady Elizabeth Foster, Bess, as an intimate fixture in their household. It was a triangular arrangement that looked civilized because luxury can almost make anything look civilized. Georgiana accepted it, then had an affair with the young Charles Grey. Their daughter, Eliza, was raised quietly with the Greys for a time. Georgiana went abroad, returned, and did what she always did, turned pain into gentleness and parties into politics. She died in 1806, mourned by a public inclined to forgive her because she had been beautiful and generous while breaking the rules they secretly enjoyed watching her break. The Pharaoh-mania spread beyond her drawing room. Lady Buckinghamshire ran a famous bank. Lady Archer, too. The caricaturists called them Pharaoh's daughters, a phrase that sounds like a Greek tragedy until you realize it mostly involved late hours, sharp looks, and long lists of debtors.
Down a few doors, the Prince of Wales kept court at Carlton House. The prince, later George IV, collected friends, debts, and furniture with equal enthusiasm. He wore elegance like armor, and for a while it worked. Henry Holland, the architect, helped turn Carlton House into a gallery of tasteful excess. Painted ceilings that looked expensive even in the dark. Lacquered screens hinting at worlds you could borrow but not pronounce. The prince's set, Fox, Sheridan, the Devonshires, and a rotating cast of wits and women, treated the place like a stage for sincerity at midnight and theater by noon. Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he secretly married in 1785, despite the Royal Marriages Act, was the soft center of his otherwise restless orbit. She was Catholic, which made the union both invalid and inconvenient in every possible way. Still, she steadied him when the world didn't, and the world usually didn't. He owed everyone. His taste in cabinet makers and clocks was flawless. His arithmetic, not so much. Parliament bailed him out more than once, in exchange for promises that lasted until someone showed him a new fabric. When his father's mind faltered in 1788-9, the Regency crisis cracked London into factions. Would the prince become regent and elevate his Whig friends? Would the king recover? He did, inconveniently for the prince. Carlton House survived the moment with more chairs than clarity. If we scroll down to the assemblies, Almack's on King Street, here's where the social temperature cools just a little. The famous patroness's controlled entry with vouchers and a devotion to rules that felt almost religious. No gambling here, at least not officially. No masquerade chaos. Dancing, decorum, and the power to deny. It was a preview of the 19th century compromise, pleasure under supervision. The Libertines' grandchildren would learn to enjoy themselves while pretending not to. The mask of respectability settled in permanently and started asking for a chair. Let's pause with the press, calmly sharpening its quill. Town and Country magazine ran tête-à-tête engravings, paired portraits of rumored lovers with coy captions. It turned gossip into a parlor game and taught the public to consume scandal politely, with tea. The monthly ritual of unveilings kept reputations soft around the edges and gave the middle classes a front-row seat in rooms they weren't invited to. Meanwhile, caricaturists, Gilray, Rowlandson, kept aiming their little knives. A print could erase months of careful behavior in a morning. Satire was the tax the elite paid for living past midnight. They grumbled and kept going. We said last time that libertinism built an architecture of secrecy. By the 1780s, that architecture had become an interior style. Concealed doors, retiring rooms, spaces that could host a sober breakfast and a lively after-midnight conference without moving the furniture. The prince took this portable secrecy and sent it to the seaside.
Brighton started as a health retreat. He turned it into an experiment. The Marine Pavilion began modestly, then blossomed into the Royal Pavilion with its chinoiserie and domes, dragons that looked politely bored. That would come later, in the 1810s, but the appetite for fantasy architecture had mid-century roots. If you can build a landscape to suit your mood, why not build a mood to suit your landscape? The clubs multiplied their rituals. The Anachronistic Society gathered at the Crown and Anchor, praising wine and song, borrowing the name of a Greek poet who adored both. Their club anthem, To Anachron in Heaven, would accidentally donate its melody to the Star-Spangled Banner later. A detail to enjoy. A Georgian drinking song ends up hosting an American anthem. History is less linear than it pretends. Alongside these choruses, another style rose, the macaronis of the 1770s, young men back from the Grand Tour with hair high enough to interfere with neighboring clouds and clothes that made their grandfathers exhale loudly. They ate foreign food, wore foreign fabrics, and confused the city with gender play that was mostly fashion and occasionally a dare. Gilray and his peers loved them, of course, and turned the macaroni into a walking joke. But behind the laugh was something real, a culture experimenting with presentation, with what masculinity might look like when it wasn't large and loud. It wasn't liberation. It was curiosity in satin, which is something.
A different curiosity lived in quieter rooms. London's molly houses, subcultures of men who desired men. These were not libertine playgrounds for aristocrats with classical alibis. They were fragile social worlds that endured risk and raids. In the 1720s, Mother Clapp's Molly House had been broken by prosecutions. By the later century, the spaces resurfaced, disguised, and wary. When libertine talk boasted about transgression, it meant something different here. Less philosophy, more survival. The city knew how to punish what it pretended not to see. Hover now with the Chevalier d'Eon, the French diplomat and spy who lived in London, fought duels, wrote books, and presented as a woman for much of a very complicated life. Crowds were fascinated. Bets were laid on the Chevalier's sex, because of course they were, which says more about London than it does about d'Eon. The Chevalier fenced in a dress, debated like a senator, and broke categories with a calm that embarrassed the spectators. The libertine century loved the spectacle of ambiguity, as long as ambiguity came with tickets. Let's step back into the law's long corridor. In 1787, George III's proclamation on vice prompted the formation of moral society committees that watched, sued, and occasionally carted people off whose names weren't in the right address book. By 1802, the Society for the Suppression of Vice had formed, with earnest patrons like William Wilberforce in the background and the Bowdler temperament brewing in the air. Publications were scolded, faro tables were nudged into storage, obscene prints disappeared from some windows and moved into drawers. The late Georgian Compromise was under construction. Pleasure would not vanish, it would change its address. The medical world had its own shelves of reminders. The Locke Hospital near Hyde Park treated venereal disease from the 1740s. The Magdalen and Locke Asylums tried to reform and house fallen women. The language was pious. The reality was logistical. Cities generate consequences. The elite version of libertinism floated past these doors on its way to Vauxhall and Ranelagh. People noticed. Charities rose. Committees multiplied. Sermons lengthened. It didn't stop the parties, it wrapped them in caution. We should look again at the CONN trials because they were Georgian theater conducted by lawyers. A husband sued his wife's lover for damages. The public listened as private lives were treated like account books. Sometimes verdicts punished hypocrisy, Worsley's famous 1 shilling. Sometimes they turned women into commodities priced on perceived injury. Print shops made money either way. For all the reformers' earnestness, nothing encouraged vice like a courtroom with open doors. Underneath this spectacle, there were quieter rooms of intellect competing for attention. The Bluestockings gathered, Elizabeth Montagu, Frances Boscawen, Hester Chapone, later Hannah More, preferring conversation to cards. No pharaoh here. Essays, poetry, polite debate. They offered a model of sociability that didn't require disguises or dice. You could call them earnest. Many did. You could also call them durable. Their rooms taught Britain how to do refinement without pretending not to, an alternative to libertine glitter that, for many, felt less expensive in every sense. Back in the clubs, Fox's debts became emblematic. His friends raised funds. He borrowed from everyone. When he died in 1806, he had finally persuaded the nation to end the slave trade, a legislative victory large enough to quiet 1,000 caricatures. The contradiction stands politely in the doorway. A man who couldn't manage his purse helped manage a moral reform that would outlive him. Georgian England specialized in that kind of paradox, excess and achievement sharing a carriage, arguing quietly across the back seat.
The prince kept doing what princes do, acquiring, discarding, posing, promising. He married Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 because Parliament made it financially convenient. It was a disaster immediately. She was witty and not impressed. He was offended by honesty. The pair separated after producing one heir, Princess Charlotte, whose later death in 1817 would wrench the nation and send the succession sideways. In 1806, the delicate investigation probed Caroline's conduct with a mixture of prurience and law. She survived it, in part because public opinion saw through the double standard, in part because the prince had run out of goodwill. The investigation rehearsed the Victorian taste for respectable scandal. Committees, transcripts, moral language as costume. It was libertinism's theater with the volume turned down. We should let the air cool with a note from Horace Walpole, that endlessly observant letter writer who watched the world from Strawberry Hill, his whimsical Gothic villa. Walpole chronicled the age's gaming epidemics and social contortions with a sigh and a smile, always aware that taste and excess walked hand in hand. He loved caprice as long as it didn't spill on the carpet. To see the era from above, step into a painting. Reynolds gives you nobility composed like sculpture, virtues arranged around roguish appetites. Gainsborough gives you light and air around fabric that almost sings. Both styles flatter, both hide. Portraits made legends out of people who were mostly doing their best to be plausible. A duchess's face calms a scandal. A statesman's gaze distracts from IOUs in the desk. Art does that. It keeps secrets politely. While we stay on pictures, let's look at Rowlandson's series lampooning pharaoh tables. Toothy ladies, glazed-eyed lords, coins sliding like water. The satire is broad, but the detail is true. Gambling was a narrative thread running through everything. It offered speed and certainty in a world that moves slowly and rarely told you outright how things would go. Roll, draw, lose, try again. Politics wasn't so different, so people practiced one while talking about the other. Can we talk quietly about servants? The entire libertine edifice balanced on people paid to ignore evidence and produce miracles. Flawless dinners, smooth introductions, open doors at the right time, and closed ones at the wrong. They held secrets because employment depended on it. When they talked, the city listened. When they were paid to talk, the city listened louder. Scandals have footmen in the footnotes, and their names rarely make the prints. The elite pretended they lived in private. In reality, they lived on stage, and the stagehands knew every cue. By the late 1790s and into the early years of the 1800s, war with France and domestic anxiety made heavy pleasures feel unfashionable in public. Not obsolete, never that, just quieter. The pleasure gardens adapted, the masquerade season thinned. Family portraits emphasized children and Labrador retrievers. The Society for the Suppression of Vice filed cases with the patience of a clerk. The prince visited Brighton and learned that fantasy architecture works even better at the seaside. And in a corner of London, a tailor named Beau Brummel began refining the male silhouette into a studied simplicity, clean lines, perfect laundry, Nothing gaudy. The dandy replaced the macaroni, and with him came a new lesson. Restraint can be its own form of provocation. Before we place bookmarks, let's return softly to a few women whose names don't carry the gilt finish, but carry truth. Sophia Badley, whose acting and singing led to fame, whose patrons led to glitter, and whose accounts led to sorrow. Nancy Parsons, once mistress to noblemen who hired her for wit and looks, and forgot to imagine that the bills continued after flowers wilted. Frances Abington, who navigated the stage and select rooms with dexterity, and retired with something like comfort because she was stubborn about herself. These lives show the book balancing across a generation. Some escaped, some didn't. All learned that society priced them the way it priced furniture, on fashion, condition, and whether last year's model was still exciting.
Even the architecture turned moral. West Wycomb's church, with its golden ball, watched over a community that went to work and to bed without grottos. The caves beneath, cool, performative, became folklore and then tourist curiosities. The fake abbey at Medmenham softened into lovely ruins. Every parody decays into something gentler if you give it time and tend the ivy. We shouldn't forget that many libertines were also legislators, soldiers, patrons of science, founders of museums. They funded painters, paid for libraries, and gave to causes in between dinners. The same hands that held dice built hospitals, not out of guilt necessarily, but from the casual belief that if you can afford wallpaper, you can afford a ward. It's an untidy ledger. That's the century. Briefly, a scandal from the next room over, in 1809, the Duke of York, the king's second son, was implicated when his mistress, Mary Ann Clark, was accused of selling army commissions with access she allegedly leveraged through him. Parliament investigated. Caricaturists went to work immediately. It wasn't a libertine orgy, it was administrative impropriety. But it smelled familiar. Private relationships bending public duty. The nation tisked, adjusted, and filed the lesson. Again. The city's pleasures professionalized. What had been explicit societies became networks. The masquerade turned into a masquerade of respectability. Clubs learned to check the door more carefully. Almacs handed power to women who wrote names on vouchers and kept whole seasons in their handbags. It was a different kind of secrecy, the kind that doesn't look like secrecy at all. You might argue that this was the libertines' greatest legacy, a way of living privately in public that outlasted their games. We can end tonight where we began, back at the gaming table in a quiet room at Brooks's. The candles are shorter. Fox is older or gone. The new men sit carefully, half remembering cautionary tales, half pretending they don't. A servant glides by, the perfect witness to nothing. Across town, the prince has fallen in love again with furniture, again with someone else, again with the idea that next year will be easier. In a smaller house, a woman folds her dress into a box, sighs at a letter, and decides to take another part on stage, because that is what she knows how to do. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. The cards will still be here when you wake. The clubs will open their doors at the usual hour. The city will arrange itself into straight lines while the people inside it draw curves. We've watched pharaoh hands and marriage contracts tilt under the same lamps. We've seen how a duchess could be a campaign manager and a debtor, how a prince could build a palace out of promises, how a poet could drink to Bacchus and write something that mattered in the morning. Next time, we'll drift into the long afterglow, the Regency, dressed to the nines, arranging itself lest anyone suspected of being fun. The committees with their carefully folded paperwork, the Brighton Pavilion finding ways to look expensive from every perspective, the slow conversion of elite excess into the Victorian habit of whispering. For tonight, the city sleeps, the dice are tucked away, and the last coach clatters off down St. James's Street, leaving the stones to cool.
Hey again. Lights low, voices softer, the city wrapped in shawls.
We're drifting into the Regency now, those careful years when the old libertine energy put on a better coat, tightened its cravat, and learned to say please. The music didn't stop. It just decrescendoed into something that looked respectable if you squinted. In other words, perfect for bedtime. The formal line is simple enough. George III's mind faltered. In 1811, the Prince of Wales became Prince Regent. Governance moved to the son who loved furniture, flattery, and a good supper. The culture followed. Sensation thinned into sheen. The mask became the face. Let's float to Carlton House one more time. Rooms drenched in taste, chairs that looked like they knew they were important. The prince moving through the corridors, deciding which friend to forgive, which debt to ignore, and which mirror to admire today. He had help. The age of theatrical transgression had hired a valet named Restraint. His name was Beau Brummel. Brummel is what happens when a man turns laundry into philosophy. He invented a kind of anti-luxury luxury. Immaculate linen, subdued wool, clean lines, no lace mountains, no jewel eruptions, a neckcloth tied like a quiet sermon. He took hours to achieve a look that said he hadn't tried at all. It wasn't simply fashion, it was control. Say less, mean more, never sweat in public. It worked beautifully until it didn't. Because the secret to being a mirror is to remember you reflect someone else's face. Brummel forgot. He rose quickly in the prince's favor. Jokes like pinpricks, dinners where nothing happened except everything. Social power through exclusion. The cut direct, that elegant act of looking through you, was one of his signatures. He turned it on the prince in 1813, half in jest, which is the most dangerous half. Alvinley, who's your fat friend? The room remembered. The prince remembered longer. Friends gathered debts on Brummel's behalf as he drifted out of favor. In 1816, he left for Calais to escape creditors. Exile by ledger. He was briefly appointed consul at Cannes in 1830, lost it in 1832, endured debtor's prison, and died in 1840, the Prince of Soap, undone by bills. He left behind a silhouette that would outlive him. Men tailored into discretion. Libertinism learned to tuck in its shirt. But under the smooth wool, nerves still thrummed. Enter Lord Byron, poetry's most conspicuously flammable aristocrat. He burst into public delirium in 1812 with Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and suddenly the city was buying books about ruin the way it used to buy tickets to masquerades. He cultivated the image, of course. Dark looks, dark moods, complicated life. If he hadn't been born, a publisher would have invented him. Lady Caroline Lamb, bright and unquiet, met him and wrote the line that did half his public relations for the decade. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. She wasn't wrong. They burned through each other the way people do when oblivion looks like romance. There were scenes, there were letters, there were rumors that absolutely did not calm anyone down. At one ball, she arrived dressed as a page and made sure Byron noticed. He did. The room noticed more. After the break, she wrote Glenarvan in 1816, a novel revenge with all the names slightly shuffled and badly disguised. The city immediately recognized itself, because the city loves recognizing itself.
Byron married Annabella Milbank in 1815. She had algebra, he had mood. It lasted a year. Their separation unleashed more rumor than a dozen pamphlets. He left England in 1816, trailed by whispers he pretended not to hear. Italy suited him. So did Greece, where he died in 1824 at Missolonghi. Fever, not bullets, trying to do something larger than himself for once. The libertine poet found a battlefield and then found out the human body is not theatrical equipment. His friends politicized the grief. His readers kept the portrait over the desk. Meanwhile, his former lovers and his wife dealt with the aftermath quietly because, even in scandal, the paperwork falls to women. Around the same time, a different pen cut cleaner lines into the elite's costumes. Harriet Wilson, celebrated courtesan of the 1810s, published her memoirs in 1825, and a lot of people suddenly developed reading habits. Wilson's book is the sound of a woman reclaiming narrative and rent simultaneously. She wrote to former lovers, offering the option to subscribe to her silence. Some paid, many didn't. The Duke of Wellington, famous for beating Napoleon and not for tact, supposedly replied to her overture, "Publish and be damned." So she did. Names, anecdotes, the casual grudges of a decade turned into chapters. The memoirs unsettled the ton not because they were lurid, they weren't especially, the prose is brisk and often funny, but because they were female, direct, and unapologetically commercial. She was doing what gentlemen had done to women for generations, converting intimacy into capital. Of course, the market punished her later, as markets do, but for a season she held the city by the lapels, and it listened. If you want to watch elite sociability under supervision, step into Almack's. Vouchers controlled by a small council of patronesses, Lady Jersey, Lady Cowper, Countess Lieven, and friends governed entry. Your title helped. Your coat did too. Your smell of new money did not. You needed proper introductions, correct boots, and the grace to leave by 11. Rules: no late arrivals, no heavy perfumes, the dancing proper, the room cool. The waltz, imported, was a controversy in itself, hands on waists, faces too close. It was permitted cautiously, at first for a chosen few with the right decorum. People murmured that civilization was ending. Civilization sighed and went home early. Lady Jersey here is a reminder that the same name can be two stories. Frances, Countess of Jersey, was the prince's mistress in the 1970s, elegant and offensively competent. Sarah Sophia, later Countess of Jersey, granddaughter of the banker Robert Child, was a patroness of Almack's and a force in polite gatekeeping. The first helped teach the prince his weaknesses. The second helped teach London its new manners. If Carlton House represented urban satin, Brighton did seaside fantasy. The Marine Pavilion expanded into the Royal Pavilion, with onion domes and chinoiserie that turned English weather into a backdrop for collected Asia. Inside, dragons discovered that if you gild them sufficiently, no one asks if they're comfortable. The prince loved it. It let him be someone else while remaining at home. That was the era's perfect trick. Reinvention without departure. The pavilion is the Libertine grotto reincarnated in stucco. Outside these rooms, committees kept hydrating themselves with piety. The Society for the Suppression of Vice, founded in 1802, took George III's earlier proclamation on vice like a marching order that never expired. They pursued obscene prints, illegal gaming, Sunday trading, and anything that combined fun with a lack of receipts. Success varied. You can prosecute a bookseller, you can't prosecute a rumor. You can shut down a faro bank, another opens where the drapes are thicker. What these societies did very well was teach public language new reflexes. Vice became social evil. Pleasure became temptation. The city learned to look at its reflection and frown, then order more mirrors. Meanwhile, the Regency perfected scandal as civic theater. No performance shows this better than the saga of Queen Caroline, the wife the prince did not want. Maria Fitzherbert had steadied him as a private consort. The legitimate bride was Caroline of Brunswick, brilliant at being wrong for him. They married in 1895, detested each other instantly, and separated after producing one daughter, Princess Charlotte. Caroline wandered Europe, accumulating grievances and rumors like any woman alone and noticeable tends to do. When George became king in 2020, he and his ministers decided to settle the question of her existence with the Pains and Penalties Bill, an attempt to strip her of the title of queen and dissolve the marriage based on alleged misconduct abroad.
It was a trial in everything but name. Witnesses were procured. Stories were aired. The press, which never loved George as much as George loved George, took Caroline's side. Crowds rallied, processions happened, taverns toasted her. The woman who had been sloppy in every social way became, overnight, the nation's favorite symbol of fairness. If the king could keep his mistresses, why couldn't the queen keep her dignity? The lords balked. The bill was withdrawn. In 1821, at the coronation, Caroline tried to enter Westminster Abbey and was turned away at the door. It was perfect, a public drama with clear blocking. She died weeks later. The country grieved. The king carried on. The moral of the story was footnoted in every drawing room. Hypocrisy looks terrible in a crown. George's circle during these years rotated mistresses with the regularity of a carousel. Maria Fitzherbert held the real affection. The Marchioness of Hertford and later Lady Cunningham held social gravity. The joke is easy. The queen at the door while the mistress occupies the chairs. But beneath the joke is a structure. Private relationships had always bent public duty. In the Regency, the bending was conducted behind better curtains and accompanied by better musicians. Amid the candlelight, the press sharpened its own knives and occasionally swallowed them. William Hone's trials in 1817 are instructive. Accused of blasphemous libel for satirical parodies on political themes, he defended himself with relentless calm, and juries acquitted him again and again. Cruikshank illustrated his pamphlets, jagged, funny, merciless. The result was a small library of legal precedent reminding governments that satire isn't treason, even when it makes you uncomfortable at breakfast. On the other side of the room, Thomas Boldler did something many readers still privately appreciate. In 1818 and 1820, he published The Family Shakespeare, removing words and expressions he deemed improper for domestic reading. Critics mocked. Families bought it. Boldler didn't destroy Shakespeare. He repackaged him for rooms like Almack's, a reminder that Britain was busy inventing a private sphere where children could read and adults could breathe without pretending to be libertines or Puritans. Call it compromise literature. Beyond the salons and reforms, people kept building lives under precarious ceilings. Harriet Mellon, a former actress, married the banker Thomas Coutts, became wildly wealthy, and later married the Duke of St. Albans. She was kind, blunt, and unapologetically pleased about her luck. The city took notes, some of them unkind. She was proof that occasionally the ladder does not tip. Sometimes it becomes a balcony. Frances Abington retired with comfort. Sophia Badley did not. There is no formula, only stories, and the ledger keeps whispering in the background. The servants continued to hover at the edge of our vision. They carried petitions, dried glasses, and opened doors no one admitted existed. They knew when to cough. They knew when not to. Occasionally, they testified. The Regency's love of oversight committees, with their long titles and longer minutes, did not extend to improving the wages of those who kept their secret machinery humming. The age that polished the concept of privacy did it on a platform of other people's labor. The platform rarely made it into portraits. We should drift out of the capital to a handful of houses where politics and pleasure learned to share chairs without talking. Holland House in Kensington, presided over by Lord and Lady Holland, became a Whig salon. Less dice, more debate. There was still gossip, because this is London, but it wore longer sentences. The house became a shorthand for respectable brilliance, poetry readings and parliamentary strategy over a decent supper. Nearby, the Scott family circle. Across the river, Lady Hertford's rooms, where patronage had a very particular definition. Not libertine in the caves and Latin sense.
These spaces absorbed and gentilized the old appetite. The impulse did not disappear. It learned to pair well with politics and peppermint creams.
The Regency also invented an entire class of all-night gossip delivered at breakfast by couriers disguised as newspapers. John Bull and the Morning Chronicle learned that the middle classes wanted to read what the upper classes pretended not to do. Advertising paid the rest. The same week, a Vice Society prosecuted a print seller. A different print seller sold out of caricatures lampooning the prosecution. Everyone felt superior. Everyone bought paper. We can pause briefly with the waltz. It deserves it. Imported through Vienna, it came to London with rumors and gallantries attached. Body close to body, a turn that said, "We're sharing balance." Conservatives harumphed loudly. The patronesses of Almack's allowed it, with rules. You could waltz if you had demonstrably good manners and demonstrably good control. The city pretended to be shocked for the fun of it, and then rewrote its muscle memory. The waltz is libertinism translated into exercise, a choreographed scandal that everyone agreed to call healthy. We'll breathe in the sea air at Brighton again. The pavilion's interior ate candles and returned secrets. In those rooms, the prince's delicate friends, you've met them, persuaded, calmed, and toasted. Lady Jersey the elder earlier, Lady Hertford, Lady Cunningham later. Each taught him what he most needed to know at that moment, how it felt to be admired by someone who didn't send a bill immediately. The bills came later. They always do. When Princess Charlotte died in 1817, George's only legitimate heir with Caroline, the nation wore black honestly. She had been the hope of normality, a royal who might love her husband, manage her finances, and enjoy music without turning it into a political statement. Her death at 21 ended a storyline the country had privately invested in. It also set the succession adrift, leading to a generation of elderly uncles scrambling to marry and produce heirs. Nothing about this was libertine in the fun sense. It was administration in mourning clothes. The scandal machinery, temporarily out of material, turned to committee reports. Still, the old habit of turning private into public law didn't rest. In 1809, the Duke of York scandal with Mary Ann Clark quietly pioneered our modern interest in whether powerful men's personal relationships affect their professional decisions. They often do. Parliament investigated. He resigned as commander-in-chief, then returned later. The lesson stuck. If it's all club, then all rooms are connected. The Regency has its tidy emblems. A card from Almack's, a starched cravat, a Cruikshank print, a Bodler volume, a waltz ending at precisely 11. Underneath the drift from libertinism to managed pleasure is visible everywhere. The elites learned that if you must indulge, do it early, with a voucher, and leave while the musicians are still awake. The committees learned that if you must reform, frame it as rescue and apply modest pressure steadily. The press learned to mix moral outrage with entertainment, which is a cocktail that stays fashionable longer than anyone expects. One more figure waves before we dim the lamps. Lady Caroline Lamb again, but in the late chapters. She had spent herself against Byron and the expectations of her class. Her books scandalized, her health frayed. She died in 1828, without public applause. The city, having consumed her drama, evolved new tastes. It's typical. Libertinism loved women's brightness and punished their duration. The Regency perfected the trick of calling it taste.
If you need a moral inventory, quiet, unhurried, here it is. The century that started with caves, masquerades, and laughing Latin ended with committees, vouchers, and careful prints. The impulse was the same: bend the rules while pretending to respect them. The apparatus changed. Instead of secret societies, there were semi-public systems designed to make transgression look like a misunderstanding. Instead of candles guttering underground, there were chandeliers hung just high enough that you could pretend not to see what was happening beneath them.
And of course, it didn't stop at 1820. The Victorian habit of whispering is already leaning against the doorframe. Soon we'll have the moral rhetoric of purity, the administrative obsession with regulation, and a new set of euphemisms so polite even the furniture blushes. But that's for later. We're not rushing. The point of bedtime is that it takes its time. For now, let's let the prince put away his mirrors. Let Almack's close at a Christian hour. Let Brummel's laundress fold one more shirt. Let Byron's readers put down the volume and remember they have tasks in the morning. Across the river, a Vice Society clerk extinguishes his candle and dreams of neat files. At Brighton, the pavilion sits under a damp moon, pretending to be somewhere else. It's a convincing performance. It usually is. If your eyes are heavy, let them go. If you're still awake, we'll keep drifting soon. Next time, we'll watch as the whisper becomes policy. Obscenity will acquire an act. Disease will acquire a set of contagious rules that say more about fear than medicine. We'll peek at how Victorian respectability domesticated the libertine instinct without ever quite defeating it. For tonight, the rooms are quiet. The last service bell has been silenced. And somewhere, a voucher for next Thursday's assembly is already being written in a careful hand, promising pleasure that will end promptly at 11.